you put yourself in the shoes of an investor, what sort of due diligence would you perform, if you're buying a property for yourself and, if you're, asking a person to do a depreciation report for you?
That's a really good question. The reviews and the person who wrote the report, that's really important because there's also many deductions, which I didn't get into. There's the low value pool, so items that are less than $1,000, generally you can just claim $1,000 instantly, right?
Yeah.
New cadet is not going to know that. If they have just started, they're not going to know that. They're not going to claim it at that rate, right? And so, you won't get that deduction straight up front.
Hello and welcome to Helpmebuy Property Podcast. Today's property podcast is all about property depreciation, how the property depreciation works, what is the stuff that is worth claiming, what are the changes in property depreciation world that happened in November 2017. We'll talk about all of these things in relation to the new and the old properties and the key items that a lot of people don't remember claiming in. And the most important question, does the property inspector needs to be on site when they are basically doing property depreciation reports for you? Now, before I go into a lot more detail in discussing all of this, let me introduce my co-host today, Jack Mella from Mella Corp. Hey, Jack, how are you today?
Yeah, not too bad. How are you, Moss?
I am amazing. This is our new episode and the new season 2 of Help Me Buy Property Podcast. We are discussing property depreciation and you are the expert for property depreciation. So let's get right into the topic, Jack. How does the property depreciation works? Like the method, the tax statements, how does it help the investor? Let's go into a bit more detail.
So the property tax depreciation is essentially an assessment of the future wear and tear of the property. So when you've got a new item installed, that is subject to depreciation, the same as if you buy a new car, you can claim depreciation. It's exactly the same thing, except this is more specific to buildings. So there's a general rule of thumb that if you haven't touched your property for more than 30 years, then it's generally not worth getting a depreciation schedule. But if it's been touched in the last 30 years, if there's something new, then that's depreciation that you can claim and it's worth it.
Sure. And usually most of the times, when you look at the property depreciation reports, they would split them into capital work deductions and plant and equipment. And so how do you differ between the two?
Sure. It's really quite simple. So the capital allowances is more like the structure of the building, the concrete reinforcement, that kind of thing. Whereas the plant and equipment is more, it's honestly a bit of a misnomer. But if you think the items that depreciate the fastest would be your machines, like your appliances, washer, dryer, dishwasher, stovetop, and then it goes down the list into ranking, I suppose, as to what you can claim that is less worth it. The, bench tops, floor finishes, that kind of thing.
Nice. And one of the most important questions that from a user's and the listener's perspective is that how does depreciation statements help a typical investor?
Yeah, so really from what I've seen, the depreciation schedules, it's where you can't claim your repairs and maintenance. So if you've got a bit of a bad tenant who, say, sits and takes a selfie on a basin and they break it, that's just repairs and maintenance. That needs to get repaired. That's claimable at 100%, which is great. But for the rest of the items, it's good to know or take some solace in that the general wear and tear on the property, that you can claim too. And so generally what's in your base building or any renovations, or even like I was saying, the structural works, the capital allowances, that can be claimed separately. And the deductions are quite juicy. I often see a good 20 grand claimable in the first.
And this is more, you're talking about the new properties, right? So when you talk about older properties, is it, and you've briefly touched on this, when you're talking about older properties and the depreciation on older properties, are you saying that if there is not a lot of work done on the property or there is no renovations done on the property, typically you can't, getting a depreciation report is not worth it?
Well, like I was saying, generally not. But with that said, you'd be surprised. There's things you don't think of that are all claimable. Just as a really small example, I actually jointly own an investment property with my family, and we replaced the carpet. The carpet was very, very old carpet. It had already completely depreciated. I don't think it had been touched since the 1930s, right? I put a new carpet, and because that carpet technically wasn't damaged, it wasn't destroyed or anything, that's tax depreciation. You can claim that, and you should claim that in your next tax year, because you'll get a certain proportion back. That's usually worth it. So that's why I say if it's untouched in the last 30 years, which I'd hope you've done a little bit of work, but if you haven't, then that's when it's not.
And ultimately, all of this comes down to the useful life of the asset, right? Or any plant and equipment basically that you are putting in, and you're depreciating it over that life of that useful life of the asset, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the ATO actually has this very extensive document. We've tabulated it, and since I haven't had to look at it, but there's all sorts of things. It doesn't just apply to residential property. It can be commercial properties too. And it's got a list of all the assets and what they've effectively deemed to be, or what they've deemed to be the effective life of each asset. So it literally, it lists, and I'm waiting to see this one day, but peanut crunches. If you've got any peanut crunches in your property, there are some juicy deductions to be claiming that.
Wow. What's a peanut crunch?
Well, I'm guessing it's, farms out there. There's a big shed where they produce peanut.
Oh, wow. Okay. Literally peanut.
I guess there's a machine and it depreciates. And
wow.
I can't remember what they said, how long it lasts, but that, say it lasts 10 years, then you get to claim, if it's a $50,000 peanut cruncher, you get to claim 10% a year.
Wow. And it's interesting, I think, ATO being as explicit, and these, rules go back so far behind, right? But, let's talk about the November 2017 tax depreciation changes. And, there was a lot of, noise around that time. I still remember where, the tax office, showed those changes and declared, war on, investment properties, and everyone started thinking, oh my God, you shouldn't be buying investment properties anymore because the tax depreciations have disappeared. For the users and listeners, let's talk a bit about, what were those changes, and, how does that, impact people?
Sure. I mean, the changes themselves were pretty massive. It used to be fairly laissez-faire as to how they would get quantity surveyors to do these sorts of things, the allowances for negative gearing, all that sort of thing. But nowadays, there's a lot more due diligence that the QSs have to do. And if we forget about that for a second, the post-2017 changes. So generally, as you said, there's capital allowances and tax depreciation. Sorry, I don't mean to be doing this, but the tax depreciation is essentially the plant and equipment, those items that depreciate faster, whereas the capital allowances, they basically say it's got a 40-year life, so you only get to claim 2.5% per year, right?
Yeah.
Now, what they've basically said is that post 2017, if you buy a second-hand property and not new property, you can't claim that tax depreciation as such. You can claim the decline in value of the structure, which still adds up. It still makes it worthwhile, just not in that case scenario where it hasn't been touched in the last 30 years.
Yeah. And so I think the biggest difference is typically that, the capital work deductions, which typically makes about, 85 to 90% of the depreciation claim anyway, right? And so the new assets that you're putting in, and if they are income producing, you could still claim them. But anything that has been previously used as plant and equipment typically, or, something that can easily be removed, right? Like hot water system or smoke alarms or curtains.
Off there for a second. So yes, but the issue, the good thing is that a lot of people do renovate. They do new items without actually knowing that they're renovating, or without the thought crossing their mind, hey, should I get a new tax depreciation schedule for this, or is it something I can just inform my accountant? If you can, do it.
Sure.
But, if you've had to put in a whole new kitchen, only need a proper estimate of costs on it because you haven't kept track of it.
Yeah.
That's something that we can do. And we've got excellent benchmarks, thousands of projects to look upon.
Amazing.
To go and back up our costs, essentially, so
and
that it can be audited and we can answer all their questions.
Nice. And just to clear this a bit more so that, people can understand this a bit more. Yeah, when they talk about items previously used and someone is changing it, say, for example, if I have a property and I put in a brand new hot water system and a brand new, say, dishwasher, I can claim those things. But if I sell the property to someone else, that person can still claim these items as well?
Yeah, well, that's what they used to be able to do, and that's where they cracked down. To be honest, there is a good reason for it. I don't want to get too technical, but basically what it is there's two methods of claiming depreciation. One is essentially the faster way, which is known as the diminishing value method, and the other one is prime cost. Now, with the prime cost method, it's essentially an equal rate. So if it's a $5,000 item that depreciates at 20% per year, it's just $1,000 a year for 5 years until the asset is deemed useless, right? Now, with the prime cost method, you can also choose to claim, I just want to claim it at half that rate, right, per year. And basically, one is double the other, but towards the end of that period, you get less, right? And when you transfer the properties, I don't know how you, I suppose,
claim
past.
Yes.
And that's where they sort of go, well, if you don't know that, then, and they don't allow you to just change and decide, I want the quick upfront deduction, and then say later on when you sell it, I also want the quick upfront deduction, when that's already been claimed by the previous owner. That's why they did that.
Of course. And so there was a lot of double dipping that was basically happening because, I might
exactly right. That's exactly the right word to put it.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. And so that definitely means that, properties which are a lot more newer would have a lot better depreciation versus older properties. But to just sum all of this up, that doesn't mean that older properties do not need tax depreciation schedules. Older properties, because the capital nature of events are still there, and you would still get the juice out of it as well, even though that they're old properties. Okay. Let's segue the conversation to something, that I've seen out in the open and no one talks about this. And this is more in relation to developers, providing free depreciation schedules, to make their properties, sell we have these free depreciation schedules attached to it. And then, you have surveys, that would provide, some of these depreciation reports, which are very stock standard, out of the box, basically, right? How do you feel about that? Let's talk a bit about that. Should you trust, these free depreciation schedules coming in from these developers?
To be completely honest with you, I've never been asked to do one, so it might be something worth coming back to you on. But what I will say is that so long as they've considered, I guess, each of the apartment types, and the apartment types are fairly standard, then I would say that's okay. But even if there's 3-bed, 2-bath, but there's 2 different types of 3-bed, 2-bath, so there's 3-bed, 2-bath A and 3-bed, 2-bath B that have different square meterages. That's, you need one for each apartment type.
Correct. Yes.
So I would be a little bit skeptical as to how they got to that.
My experience has been that, the developers, while they try to make this as a bells and whistles sell where, hey, we are giving you something extra, I feel that, there is not a lot of due diligence that goes in, preparing these, and they are very stock standard across the whole development. And so, spending that extra money on getting a second pair of eyes in there, making sure that, you're providing the right level of knowledge, to the inspector, so that, you get the schedule where you're not missing out on these things, right? Is quite important. It's not money wasted, it's money well spent, so that, you can get a better depreciation coming out of some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it falls down to your level of preparation, or for me at least as a QS, the level of preparation that's gone into making these schedules. I've done ones on Central Park, which is just opposite UTS in Sydney, and that was a real, one-of-a-kind building that had a horizontal cantilevered mirror that reflects the western sun. That's never been seen before on any other development, right? They had obviously the pools and gyms, you can claim a portion of that, and the standard in general was just very high, and I don't know whether that could be forecasted. I was able to, because I'd worked on the original design and everything, and throughout every step of the job I was able to break down all of that, which is great, but I don't know whether another QS can do that before the design has even been done.
Yeah.
So there's that. And, I've actually done some schedules for the top 5 wealthiest people in Australia as well. And,
wow,
it's no secret that they don't like paying any more tax than they need to. And they also invest quite heavily in their consultants. And so I would visit their offices and they would have a security guard watching me like a hawk to make sure I didn't leak any public information. They had a security guard who watches them as they vacuum the couch. You see a lot of stuff, but basically my point is not that. My point is that it's good to do the backing work, and I'm sure you're going to ask me a bit more about visiting the site later on, but yeah, we'll get to that.
And I think that's a good segue, right? Let's get right into it. So, one of the biggest stereotypes that sits in the industry basically is that, does the inspector needs to be on the site, or can you do a desktop, property depreciation report?
Yeah, so you can definitely do a desktop property depreciation report. It's a misconception that it's not compliant or whatever if you don't physically visit the site. Oftentimes, I'm sure there's companies that send cadets or even students out to visit the site, and that can be a worthwhile exercise, but really what it falls down to is your level of preparation. And I was speaking to you just before, and if you've been working on the job since the start, if you've visited the site every month while they're building it, you have everything behind the builder's claim, you have the real world costs, then that's all there for you. It's there in black and white. No site visit is ever going to contest that information that is there. You rely on the information and you claim every single bit. The studios have microwaves, whereas the one betters, say for example, in this instance, they've got actual ovens, that kind of thing. So you get a better picture. Where you might come a bit unstuck, or what is good practice as a quantity surveyor, is to ask them, what have you installed after you bought this place? Little things, little items of furniture. Don't just assume that because a bed that is there, a gas strut bed, don't just assume the tenant installed that. That could have been the landlord. The blind, who installed that? Was that the tenant? Who paid for that? Should I be putting that in my schedule? Because those are also quite juicy deductions.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, this stereotype about, you need to be on site versus you don't need to be on site, it comes down to, your level of due diligence and your level of attention to detail as well, isn't it? I see people rocking up to the site and, spending, -2 minutes on the site and basically walking out. And I always question as to how much have you captured versus, you giving a detailed list of things and pictures and stuff to an inspector, and they would do a much better job sitting behind the computer than, a person just walking through the house in 2 minutes, right?
Sure. I mean, generally speaking, like I was saying, I would suppose if you're working on any mid to large scale residential project, then generally speaking, they would have had a QS that's already worked on the original building, and of course, probably better to honestly just go with them. Whereas some of the other depreciators out there will simply they'll offer a few levels of services where there might be one which is, desktop only. They look it up on Google. They might offer one where, you send us some photos and we take a bit more of a detailed view. And then they might have one where they visit the site. But just because they visit the site does not necessarily mean that, you're going to get a better result.
Outcome. Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, 100%. And I completely agree. I think it makes a lot more sense that, you choose the person based on their attention to detail and their own experience versus just picking up a big name, right? I see a lot of these ads where, they are pitching it to AI and, they are basically saying, oh, we can get this, off the shelf tax depreciation calculator because you just put in the address and, we'll just spit out a tax depreciation for you. And I always sort of, put my paranoid cap on and think as to, okay, how good of a job does this thing does, without even knowing whether this property has gone through renovations or what has it gone through in the changes, and it's just taking it based on the face value of what is available on Google, right?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, that's something I've honestly never heard of in terms of depreciation, but I do know that there's some companies where you log on and you tell them roughly what it is, and it probably honestly will give you a decent idea. It's just not, it doesn't
Detail.
backing, it doesn't have that detail, and what it would be, I assume, is, we've done all these 2-bed, 1-bath, 1-car space units, boy, yours is this.
Very similar.
So, and it's probably worth this price. So based on our benchmarks, it's this. But, I can think of an example here where just across the bridge in Sydney, we've got Piedmont, and the standard of apartments vary quite drastically. I worked on one, which was, they were expecting them to sell for less than $3 million. And this was back in 2017. And those were all 2-bed, 1-bath, 1-car space units. And, then they've also got public housing and ex-public housing, which the standard would vary drastically, where you're getting a Gaggenau bloody oven.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, that's 30 grand or something. Not everyone has that, but those really important.
Yeah. I think, that makes a really good segue question, that what are the key things that people would usually forget, to put it into their claims depreciation or the property tax depreciation, and how do you go around avoiding some of these mistakes?
So that's a good question. Like I was saying, blinds are a big one, and furniture, you just can't assume, especially the standards of properties that I'm seeing in the city. They often furnish the units, even with something as little as a bed, whatever you've done, a TV frame or whatever it is, things that you got from IKEA just to make the place a bit nicer before you rent it out. That's all claimable, and you should claim that.
Wow. I think the most drastic example that I've seen is the landscaping. I saw fake grass, sitting in the back and the front yard. And that is something that I never knew personally that you could claim. And it's actually a claimable depreciation item.
Yeah. And see, that's the thing. From memory, I don't think landscaping generally is claimable. But when I'm talking landscaping, I'm talking like soft landscaping, like plants and stuff like that. But for things like fake grass, like that's actually, that's building, that is a real thing that you would probably claim at a similar rate to carpet, which is actually a very healthy claim.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I think there could be so many other items. And so ultimately it comes down to your attention to detail and how far are you going down in providing the right pictures and the right exposures. One of the things that I say to my team all the time is, run a 360 camera with the house so that, you are providing a 360 view of the whole place to an inspector so that they can see every little detail. Because, ultimately what we are doing is we are seeking tax depreciations on our rooming house products, and they are fully furnished. They have, even plates in the kitchen, etc. Right? That's massive, right? Some of these claims go up to like, $35,000, $40,000 a year. The final and the most important question, and this is me talking about it from your own personal perspective. And so if you put yourself in the shoes of an investor, what sort of due diligence would you perform, if you're buying a property for yourself and, if you're, asking a person to do a depreciation report for you?
That's a really good question. The reviews and the person who wrote the report, that's really important, because there's also mini deductions, which I didn't get into. There's the low value pool, so items that are less than $1,000. generally you can just claim $1,000 instantly, right? New cadet is not going to know that. If they have just started, they're not going to know that. They're not going to claim it at that rate, right? And so, you won't get that deduction straight up front. That's an example, but there's also, just reading the front cover, there's a blurb that explains the tax rules. And if it doesn't explain that very well, I'd be a little bit skeptical, because then you'd start to wonder, hang on, if the whole company doesn't understand the tax rules, then how can I trust the person who did this report? And how do I know they know what that?
Yeah. And typically, when you talk about the good and the bad and the ugly, within the industry, are there cases or anything that you have come across where, or any stories that you want to share in relation to the tax depreciation side of things?
So, yeah, again, one of those, the bigger companies, I'm not going to name names, but I did get a schedule, and it was actually from another QS who owned the property, and they were rightly skeptical of the schedule. And I went to the property. I don't know whether the other owner went to the property, but there was a whole area of timber flooring. Timber depreciates quite quickly. And there was a whole common area of timber flooring, which it was a landscape deck, it had barbecues, it had everything, right? And they just didn't claim any of that. And so my claim was 60% higher than theirs. And that's not uncommon, I don't think. I haven't seen
of course.
The other schedules to know, but I think that is how some of the larger companies are doing the schedules, is that they're not only not visiting the site, but they're not doing the due diligence.
Definitely. Yeah, 100%. Amazing. Any final words before we close off, Jack?
Yeah, get a depreciation schedule. If it's less than 30 years old and you've touched it.
100%. And where do people find you, Jack? If you can give a very quick shout out of your email address, your company, your full name, where can people find you online?
Yeah, sure. So it's just Jack at Mellercorp. It's mellercorp.com.au. My email address is also mellercorp.com.au. And you can find me at 101 Bathurst Street.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you very much. And for people, we'll share these links out in our socials as well. So if you want to reach out to Jack to get your depreciation schedules, please do so. I personally vouch for him. We are using as a company, we are going to use Jack very soon as a company as well on a lot of our projects as well. I've seen the level of attention and the detail that he provides. So, do reach out. If you can't, get onto Jack, we'll be putting the links in our socials as well. Thank you very much for tuning in, viewers and listeners today. This was amazing. This was awesome. If you have any questions, comments, please drop it into the questions and comment section as well. Be kind, stay safe, keep smiling, keep investing. This is Moss and Jack checking out. Adios.
Thanks, Moss.